I never thought the sound of silence would mean so much to me. Out here on my family farm, mornings used to start with nothing more than roosters crowing and the hum of a tractor engine. But one day that peace was shattered. The HOA in the nearby subdivision decided my farmland was the perfect place to extend their little private airstrip. They bulldozed a chunk of my cornfield and laid down asphalt like it was theirs to take. Planes started roaring overhead at dawn, shaking the windows of my house and spooking my cattle. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Nobody in their right mind builds a runway without approval or without asking the person who owns the land. But then I saw the smug faces of the HOA board, and I realized this was no accident. This was entitlement at its finest. They thought they could steamroll me just because I was one man standing on a farm. They had no idea who they were dealing with, because while they thought I was just some backwoods farmer trying to protect a field of corn, the truth is, happened to be the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And the people who play with planes without my permission are in for a brutal awakening. The funny part is, they thought I would be powerless. What they didn't realize was that every plane touching down on that stolen strip was a nail in their own coffin. And that was only the beginning. When you grow up on land that has been in your family for generations, you develop a bond with it. That city, folks rarely understand. Every fence post, every acre, every rusted nail in the old barn has a story. My grandfather used to say the soil remembers who cares for it. So when I came home one evening and saw fresh tire tracks cutting through the north pasture, I felt a knot form in my stomach. At first I thought maybe it was kids joyriding. Happens sometimes in the countryside. But then I spotted the survey flags, bright orange plastic markers, stabbing into my earth like little insults, rows of them neatly lined up, carving a straight path across my corn. A path leading directly toward the edge of the subdivision that had sprung up 10 years ago. That subdivision was run by a particularly aggressive HOA. They policed lawns with tape measures, fined residents for leaving trash cans visible for more than an hour, and even dictated the shade of white Christmas lights people were allowed to use. Over the years, I had ignored their drama. I lived just outside their borders, and technically, my farm was not under their jurisdiction. At least that is what I thought. 2 days later, I found out how wrong I was. A group of men in reflective vests showed up with heavy equipment. Without so much as a knock on my door, they began tearing into my field. Asphalt trucks rolled in gravel was spread, and compactors pounded the earth flat. I stormed out, demanding answers. One of the workers barely looked at me. He just pointed toward a woman, standing with her arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not her smugness. That was Karen, the HOA president. She smiled like a politician at a ribbon-cutting ceremony and said, "We are expanding our community airstrip. It will add value to all our homes and provide a modern convenience for residents." I stood there in disbelief. "You mean you are building a runway through my property?" She gave a little laugh, like I had told a bad joke. "Your property is under review. The HOA committee determined this section of land falls under community easement. You should be grateful, really. Property values will rise." I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. My family had paid taxes on this land for 70 years. I had the deeds locked in a safe. There was no easement, no agreement, just arrogance. When I told her to stop construction immediately, she waved me off. "If you have concerns, take it up at the monthly board meeting." That was the first warning. Over the next week, the chaos multiplied. The noise of jackhammers and bulldozers echoed across the valley. Dust clouds rolled into my pastures, choking my cattle. My crops withered under the weight of debris. And then came the planes. The HOA had already arranged for residents with private planes to begin using the unfinished strip. Tiny Cessnas buzzing low, rattling the shingles of my roof. I could see the pilots wave as they skimmed past my silo. My cattle stampeded at the sound, sending weeks of work into the mud. One afternoon, I watched as a plane barely cleared the tree line before banking hard. If it had stalled, it would have plowed directly into my house. I stormed over again. This time Karen was waiting flanked by two smug board members who carried binders thick with paperwork. She announced in her practiced voice that I was in violation of community guidelines for interfering with construction on my own land. They handed me a notice, threatening daily fines for obstructing community development. The arrogance was breathtaking. That night, as I sat on my porch, staring at the lights of bulldozers cutting into the earth, I felt fury boil inside me. I had dealt with bureaucrats my whole career. I knew red tape better than anyone, but never had I seen such naked entitlement. I could have shut it down instantly with a single phone call. After all, as director of the FAA, I had authority over every licensed airstrip in the country. But part of me wanted to see how far they would push this, to let them dig their own hole so deep they could never climb out. The days grew worse. They sent me additional fines for leaving machinery parked near the construction site. They accused me of damaging their freshly laid asphalt when my tractor crossed the path. They even claimed my cows were a hazard to aviation safety. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now avoided eye contact. Some were clearly thrilled about the new runway, bragging about how easy it would be to fly down to Florida for the weekend. Others looked nervous but said nothing, afraid of the HOA board. One man, an older resident named Frank, whispered to me at the feed store, "Careful, son. They ruin lives for fun." But then he added with a sly smile, "They also don't know who they are messing with, do they?" I just gave him a nod. He was right. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. I awoke to the roar of an engine far too close. Running outside, I watched in horror as a small jet attempted to land on the unfinished strip. It bounced violently twice before skidding, sideways and tearing a gouge across my remaining cornfield. The pilot managed to wrestle it to a stop only a few hundred feet from my barn. I was done watching, done letting them dig trenches into my land and claim it as theirs, done letting them endanger lives with their reckless arrogance. As Karen marched across the tarmac, heels clicking, like a queen surveying her kingdom, she announced that any complaints must be submitted in writing to the HOA secretary. That was the moment I decided their game was over. They wanted a runway. They were about to learn what federal law thought of unlicensed, unauthorized runways. And trust me, that was just the beginning. The days that followed felt like living in a circus where the clowns thought they were kings. The HOA escalated faster than I imagined. It began with fines, brightly colored papers stuffed in my mailbox accusing me of violations that made no sense. One claimed I had parked unauthorized equipment near the runway. It was my tractor sitting in my own barnyard. Another notice demanded payment for damages to the asphalt because rainwater had pooled after a storm, as if I controlled the clouds. Then came the sabotage. Someone cut the fence along my cattle pasture. I woke to find half my herd wandering dangerously close to the construction zone. When I confronted the workers, one shrugged and said, "Maybe your cows just don't like you anymore." Planes multiplied. Tiny single engines buzzing low like mechanical hornets. One pilot flew so recklessly he clipped the top of my oak tree. Limbs rained down onto my field. When I reported it, Karen sent me a letter, declaring that natural vegetation should not obstruct community aviation routes. Translation: cut down your trees because they inconvenience our hobby. Neighbors started choosing sides. A few whispered encouragement, but most went quiet. Karen and her board strutted around like royalty, throwing barbecue parties by the unfinished runway and bragging about how property values were about to soar. I was painted as the bitter farmer standing in the way of progress. One night, I heard engines revving long after dark. I crept out with a flashlight only to discover teenagers drag racing along the half-finished strip. Skid marks stretched like scars across the asphalt. When I called the sheriff, he said jurisdiction was murky. The HOA insisted it was private property and outside county interference. The absurdity piled higher every day. They even accused my dog of being an aviation threat. A notice taped to my door read, "Animal interference with runway operations will result in penalties." My old hound barely had the strength to chase rabbits, let alone airplanes. Every petty threat, every ridiculous notice added fuel to the fire inside me. Yet outwardly I stayed calm. They thought they were winning. They thought they were grinding me down with harassment. What they didn't see was that I was quietly documenting everything. Every unauthorized flight, every safety violation, every dollar funneled into that illegal project. Then came a small win, the jet that had nearly crashed weeks earlier. The FAA logs confirmed it had filed no flight plan, unauthorized, dangerous. My dirt report went into the system like a seed, planted in fertile soil. But the HOA doubled down. Karen announced, with fanfare, that they were applying for an official airfield designation. She bragged about how connections on the county board guaranteed approval. Flyers went out promising community members investment opportunities. Once the runway was officially licensed, that was when I smiled for the first time in weeks, because licensing ran through my desk, and every document they filed would lead straight into my hands. The trap was almost ready. I spent years in government work watching arrogant people hang themselves with their own paperwork. Bureaucracy is slow, but it is sharp. The first step was patience. I let them keep building, let them keep spending money and rallying neighbors. Let Karen puff herself up with speeches about vision and progress. Every dollar poured into that asphalt was a rope tightening around her neck. Meanwhile, I gathered evidence. Satellite photos showing construction without permits. Witness statements about near collisions. Audio recordings of engines roaring at illegal hours. And every letter, every absurd fine, every laughable threat. Carefully scanned and catalogued, the calm before retaliation was almost soothing. For the first time in months, I sat on my porch and sipped coffee, knowing they had no clue what storm was coming. When their application for official recognition landed on my desk, I nearly laughed out loud. The arrogance of it. They listed the Strip as a community airfield with full resident approval. They claimed safety standards had been met and that no objections existed. They lied on a federal document. That was the crack I had been waiting for. I stamped it with a giant red denied. But I did not stop there. I forwarded the entire file to compliance investigators. What followed was a slow-motion collapse. Federal agents arrived for inspections. They measured every inch of that runway. They questioned residents. They asked for proof of permits, which of course did not exist. Karen tried to bluff. She held a meeting claiming it was all a misunderstanding. That paperwork was simply delayed, but her voice cracked under pressure. Symbolically, I planted new signs along my property line. Bright, bold letters reading, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Each post hammered into the ground was like a drumbeat of inevitability. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering. The tide was turning. The more Karen fought, the deeper she sank. Her arrogance could not plug the holes in her sinking ship. And for the first time, I felt calm, confident, certain that justice was finally on its way. The day of reckoning arrived, on a crisp morning when the inspectors returned with final reports. I stood at the edge of the field as federal vehicles rolled in. Their presence was unmistakable. Badges clipped to belts, cameras flashing as they documented every violation. Karen stormed forward, demanding answers. "This is harassment," she screeched. "This is our land. Our right." An agent calmly handed her a thick packet. Unlicensed construction, unauthorized flights, fraudulent filings, violation stacked upon violation. Her face drained of color as neighbors gathered. Some gasped. Others folded their arms with grim satisfaction. One by one, planes were grounded. Owners received notices that their toys were impounded until proper clearance was granted. The runway was declared hazardous and shut down indefinitely. Then came the financial hammer. Fines that dwarfed anything they had ever threatened me with. Legal fees that spread through the HOA budget like wildfire. Suddenly, barbecue parties turned into emergency meetings. Property values plummeted instead of soaring. The queen of the HOA had been dethroned. I delivered the final blow with a single sentence spoken calmly into the murmuring crowd. This is what happens when you try to build a runway without asking the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. Silence. Then nervous laughter. Then the slow ripple of applause from the very neighbors who once avoided me. Karen stumbled away, clipboard clutched to her chest as if it could shield her from reality. Her empire built on arrogance had collapsed in full view of everyone. Justice delivered. Slowly, methodically, undeniably. The day the last bulldozer finally left my land, I stood at the edge of the field and watched the dust trail fade into the horizon. The earth was scarred, but it was mine again. No more unauthorized landings, no more fake notices, no more jets buzzing my roof with banners telling me to sell. Just sky wind and the slow rustle of corn in the evening air. You don't really understand peace until it's been stolen from you. And you don't really appreciate justice until you've had to dig it out of the ground with your own hands. Neighbors began to stop by more often after that. Some brought pies or jars of preserves. Others offered to help mend fences or plant cover crops where the runway had scarred the soil. The hostility that had poisoned the community started to evaporate. Even those who had stayed silent during the worst of it eventually came around. Shame has a way of breaking people open. One man admitted he had voted in favor of the runway because he thought it would raise his property value. He looked down at his shoes when he said it, then added that he had nearly lost his savings when the HOA siphoned funds. Another woman confessed she had been afraid of Karen's wrath, but now realized that silence had made the board stronger. We shook hands, and I told her what I truly believed. It's never too late to stand up. That became the thread that tied the whole ordeal together. Entitlement thrives when good people stay quiet. But once one person speaks up, even if it's in a whisper, others begin to find their voices too. And when voices join together, the roar of arrogance cannot drown them out. The lesson here isn't just about an HOA or a strip of asphalt. It's about power. Real power doesn't come from bullying or loudness or from fake notices pasted on barns. Real power comes from persistence, patience, and the courage to use truth like a scalpel. I could have ended it all with a single command at the beginning. I had the authority. But the real victory wasn't in proving my title. It was in proving that everyday people, armed with evidence and persistence, could take down an empire of entitlement. My role was just to guide the process and let their own arrogance collapse under its weight. The irony is almost poetic. They built a runway, thinking it would lift them higher than the rest of us. Instead, it became the strip that dragged them straight down to the ground. Looking back, I think of my grandfather's words. The soil remembers who cares for it. The runway scar is healing now, covered by young maples and fresh shoots of clover. The earth remembers who fought for it. And here's the takeaway for you watching this story unfold. When entitlement tries to bulldoze you, whether it's an HOA, a boss, a neighbor, or anyone else, remember this. You don't always need to shout to win. Sometimes the sharpest sword is quiet persistence combined with truth. Let the entitled bury themselves under their own mistakes. So what would you have done if your land, your legacy, your peace was stolen? For someone else's ego, would you fight back with fire, or would you choose patience and precision? Let me know in the comments, because I want to hear your take. And if you stuck with me all the way to the end of this story, do me a favor. Type "justice served" in the comments so I know you were here until the final line. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about me and a strip of asphalt. It was about proving that arrogance has limits and that justice doesn't always come with sirens and spotlights. Sometimes it comes with paperwork fences, replanted maples, and the sound of silence returning to a farm. And let me tell you that silence was worth every battle.